To what extent was the Civil War about slavery? It seems to me that Northern sympathizers and Southern sympathizers tend to talk past one another when discussing this subject. Pro-Northern types will argue, not unpersuasively, that the South seceded primarily to protect slavery and point to speeches made during secession conventions, correctly observing that they are littered with warnings about threats to the peculiar institution. However, Southerners are also correct when they point out that no provisions of the U.S. Constitution prohibited secession or authorized, let alone compelled, the federal government to use military force to keep the Union together. That is, the question of why the South seceded, though certainly relevant to any discussion of the war, is separate from that of why the North chose to invade the South once it did secede. It is true that many, if not most, white Southerners saw secession as the best way to protect their right to keep black people as property, but the Southerners who disagreed with them saw remaining in the Union as the best way to protect slavery, correctly as it turned out. Confederate Vice President Alexander H. Stephens is the most prominent exemplar of the latter view. Although his infamous Cornerstone speech is often cited to prove the South seceded over slavery, Stephens had opposed secession and knew how divided his state of Georgia was over disunion. Now that he was part of a new Confederate government, he had to rally his fellow white Georgians around the new Constitution and knew that emphasizing a shared belief in black inferiority was one of the most effective ways to unite a people at odds over the wisdom of the course that had been followed. Stephens had not been convinced that the Union was a greater threat to slavery than secession, nor had most people in the Upper South. Thus, if seceding was about protecting slavery, so was remaining in the Union. And indeed, the states of the Upper South at first voted against secession, only reversing course after U.S. President Abraham Lincoln called for troops to be used against their fellow Southerners. And of course, 4 slaveholding states never seceded. It is also interesting that the Provisional Confederate Congress spent relatively little of its time on slavery, believing that separation from the North had taken it off the table as a live issue. As for the North, especially early in the war, only a tiny minority of Northerners, Lincoln decidedly not among them, thought they were fighting to abolish slavery. Rather, the point was to preserve the Union at all costs. We'll explore why that was in future episodes, but for now it's worth pointing out that one of the ironies of the war was that had it ended quickly, as both sides assumed it would, slavery would have been preserved. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was a military measure that did not apply to slaveholding states that had remained in the Union or to Union-controlled territory in the South. Furthermore, many abolitionists took a dim view of the U.S. Constitution and disapproved of fighting to hold together a Union that included slavery. Horace Greeley's line that "we insist on letting them go in peace" was a common refrain in many a Northern newspaper early in the war. The immediate stakes in the political skirmishes leading to secession were over slavery where it did not exist, the territories and the northern states to which fugitive slaves had escaped, not where it did exist. Regarding the territories, the rancor and paranoia on both sides was over a matter of more symbolism than substance, since the climate and soil of the Great Plains and the Western Territories were ill-suited to the kind of staple crop plantation agriculture in which slavery thrived. With the exception of some abolitionists and proponents of colonization, Northerners wanted to keep blacks confined to the South, hence the cry for free soil, free labor, which meant free white labor. Of course, by seceding, the South effectively forfeited its claim on Southerners' rights to settle in the territories. Secession also meant the South was giving up on the U.S. government enforcing the fugitive slave law, another contentious issue in which the perceived affront to Southern honor outweighed the actual economic stakes. Southerners did fear with some reason that eventually the growth of free states would cause their permanent marginalization and the possibility that the free states would eventually be numerous enough for a constitutional amendment banning slavery. But not only was that eventuality a long way off, it could have been headed off by the Corwin Amendment, which passed Congress with Lincoln's approval and was ratified by a handful of northern and border states before events on the battlefield rendered it moot. The text of what would have been the 13th Amendment? No amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of said state. So we don't have to downplay the importance of slavery in the culture wars that led to the Civil War to see that the North wasn't waging it to end slavery or even to keep it out of the territories. Nor was the South fighting to take over the U.S. government in Washington and thereby gain the power to expand slavery into the territories. It may have seen independence as a mean to certain ends, including protecting slavery where it existed, but once independence was declared, it became an end unto itself. Goalposts tend to move during wars, and it may be said that slavery became more important of an issue for the North and less so for the South as the war progressed. We'll keep exploring the issues raised in this video in future episodes. Subscribe if you haven't already, hit that like button, and share with anyone who might be interested, and I'll see you in the next video.